So this story isn't exactly the same as what you usually hear, but it's completely otherworldly nonetheless. I work as a nurse in Sioux City, Iowa, right near the border of Nebraska. I have seen a lot in my profession, and that is a huge understatement. Any other nurse out there listening, I'm sure, can attest to it being an interesting life we lead. I love it, but I also can't believe this is what I'm doing with my life. It is a constant love-hate sort of thing. The stories I can tell are world-class, but the job can be very physically, emotionally, and spiritually draining. Nonetheless, this is the life path I have chosen, and for whatever reason, God has put me on this path for a definite purpose. I have always been open-minded and believed in God, but I never really put much thought into the afterlife. However, that all changed when I met an elderly patient who was gradually losing his mental faculties. I always felt sad for him, as I knew that his days were numbered. He barely had the ability to speak, couldn't do anything by himself, and was basically just existing most of the time. I've told my spouse countless times, if I ever get to this point in my life, it's time for me to go. His name was Mr. Johnson, and he was in his late 80s and had been suffering from dementia for several years. He was always a quiet and reserved person, barely speaking a word to anyone. I would visit him every day to check his vitals, administer medication, assist him with his daily needs, all of that kind of stuff. One day, Mr. Johnson's eyes were wide, and he was full of energy when I walked in. It caught me off guard, as I hadn't seen him like this in the years I'd taken care of him. He immediately grabbed my shoulder, pulled me towards him, and started talking about how he visited heaven. He described the most beautiful scenery and how peaceful it was. He went into great detail, describing the vibrant colors and the way the air felt. I was in shock, not knowing how to respond to this strange occurrence. I thought it had to have been a side effect of his medication, or just his dementia playing tricks on his mind. He was adamant that he visited heaven. He talked about the choir of angels singing, the euphoric energy that coursed through his veins, the smell of herbs. I had never seen anyone so excited about anything. He said more to me in those 15 minutes than he had said to me in weeks, and his energy was contagious. I zipped through my rounds with ease that day and brought joy to everyone I interacted with. It was incredible. The next day I walked in eagerly, anticipating what he was going to tell me next, but Mr. Johnson had returned to his regular state, as if he didn't even know I was there. It was disappointing, to say the least. A couple of days later, Mr. Johnson was staring daggers at me the second I walked into his room. He started telling me about his visit to hell. The way he described the heat and the torment was so vivid that it really freaked me out. He talked about how the demons laughed deviously as they tortured the screaming souls of the damned. His voice was thunderous, and he was pleading with me that he didn't want to go there when he died. My hands were trembling, and I was seriously nervous hearing his words. I called some nurses in to help me calm him down, and I got out of there as quickly as possible. I've seen some awful things in my lifetime in this profession, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes and the desperation in his voice. I walked in the next day, but not before taking several deep breaths to prepare myself for the worst. Today, Mr. Johnson was lifeless, as was his usual. I asked him if he remembered anything from yesterday. He didn't say a word, and just kept staring forward like he always did. I tried to tell myself that yesterday was just a freak occurrence, but I actually found myself believing for some reason that he actually did go to heaven and hell. It was too drastic to be anything else. He continued to be his usual lifeless self for about a week after that. It was hard for me not to be on edge around him after that, but I just tried to be professional and tell myself that it was just a freak thing. Then one day, I walked into Mr. Johnson's room, and before I could even say a word, he screamed at me to sit down. I was taken off guard, and I did as he asked. He looked me right in the eyes and now started talking about visiting purgatory. He spoke of a misty place full of fire and suffering souls. He spoke of their fervent prayers, but how they were seemingly in vain, as only the living could aid them. I was taken aback by his words, but I listened intently as he continued to describe the flames burning these souls, and yet he remained untouched by the flame. As he spoke, I could see the intensity in his eyes, and I knew that this was no mere dream or hallucination. He spoke of asking these souls what their greatest suffering was, and they responded in unison that their greatest torment was their longing for God. I could see the pain and empathy on Mr. Johnson's face as he recounted this experience to me. And then he started sobbing. I just sat there in silence, thinking about the gravity of what he had just shared with me. It was clear that Mr. Johnson had experienced something profound, and his words were having a deep impact on me. And then, Mr. Johnson died that night in his sleep. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about his stories. He had awakened something within me, a desire to learn more about the afterlife and the mysteries of the universe. I felt humbled and privileged to have been able to hear his story. As I reflected on Mr. Johnson's experiences, I realized that they had been a gift from God. I was no longer skeptical of the existence of an afterlife, and I felt a newfound sense of purpose in my work as a nurse. He taught me to approach end-of-life care with a greater sense of compassion and understanding. I will forever be grateful for the time I spent with him and the lessons he taught me. I grew up in Montana, and I spent every moment I could outdoors in some way or another. My dad was a hunting guide in the area, and I followed in his footsteps. I've always felt at home in the backcountry. I had explored some of the most remote and wild areas of the U.S., but then I took a job as a guide in Canada's Northwest Territory. The only way to get to some of these locations is by bush plane, and hunters pay you good money to take them on guided trips out there. It's some of the best hunting and fishing the world has to offer. But the land up there has its secrets, and the few who know about it want to keep it hidden. For that reason, I can't give the exact location of my story, but it's a place you'll probably never be able to go anyway. The valley is closed to hunting these days, and hikers can rarely afford to get there unless they pay a pilot. And there aren't many local pilots who will fly there anymore. Pilots can be a superstitious bunch, so they can get away with saying the place is cursed and no one bats an eye. That's the story you'll hear if you ask around. The land is cursed. Best to stay away, but that's not the real story. Of course, I had heard all the tall tales of curses throughout my years working up there, but they were just that, tall tales. Campfire stories, if you will. A lot of them were from gold rush times. Somebody found gold up there and likely made up the stories to keep other people away. Or at least that's what I thought. I was taking a group on an elk hunt. We had just been dropped off by the pilot and were scheduled to be out there for 5 days. We had electric bear fences for our camp, so I wasn't too worried. There's always a danger when you're dropped off in a remote wilderness area inhabited by dangerous wildlife, but I made sure to take proper precautions. We set up our camp near a decently sized river. It was enough to provide us with fresh water, and there were elk tracks along the river's edge. Of course, it's not just elk that frequent easily accessible water sources, so we set up the bear fence around our camp to keep any unwanted visitors out. I remember that night, hearing something moving around outside our camp. I couldn't make out what it was at the time, but it was deterred by the fence and never made an attempt to enter camp. I had my gun ready just in case it was a bear. It had just rained there the day before, so the soil around camp was soft. I figured I would check the area for tracks in the morning and see who our visitor was then. If it was a bear, we would have to move camp. Morning arrived, and I had more questions than answers. I found tracks around our camp, but they weren't anything I would have ever expected. They were human tracks, barefoot human tracks. I figured maybe we had a sleepwalker, but I asked the group, and no one claimed to have ever sleepwalked. Plus, no one among us had dirty feet, and these footprints were in the mud. That and they were on the outside of the fence. I don't imagine anyone sleepwalking would have the wherewithal to open the gate without getting shocked. And there's no way anyone could sleep through that. I found more footprints by the river. There was definitely someone out there with us, but who? And why were they barefoot? I won't lie and say I didn't consider for a moment that Bigfoot might actually be real, but these tracks were the size of normal human feet. Was someone just out here living alone off the grid? That was my best bet, but it didn't make me sleep any better at night. I know a few members of the hunting party wanted to leave right then and there, but the pilot wasn't scheduled to come and get us until 4 days later, and we had no way of contacting him. Whatever wild barefoot person invaded our camp the first night decided to leave us alone after that. We continued on with the hunt without incident. It wasn't until one of the hunters shot an elk that I figured out what was actually going on out there in the valley and why the locals urged people to stay away from it. The elk was gut shot, and we had to track the thing through some pretty rough country. I could tell the hunters were getting tired, but I didn't want to leave a wounded animal without doing everything in my power to recover it. We chose a rendezvous site at the river, and I went on alone. I tracked the elk through the forest and into a clearing on the other side. I saw the elk laying dead on the ground, but it wasn't alone. There were 3 people standing over it. I'm not quite sure how to describe them. They were definitely human. They weren't like Bigfoot or anything. They were people. They all 3 turned to look at me when I came over the hill. One of them had a stone knife in his hand, but they didn't try to attack me. They looked like they were about to start quartering the dead elk. They were shorter than average. Their skin was tan and weathered. I hesitate to call them cavemen, but that's what they looked like. They had primitive clothing made from what looked like leather. Maybe they were some uncontacted, isolated tribe. I don't rightly know. What I do know is that the 3 of them were skinny, and they looked like they needed that elk more than we did. I backed away from them before turning around and heading back through the forest. I decided not to tell anyone about my experience for years. I told the hunters I lost the elk, and that was that. I realized then that the locals know about these people. They know they live out there in the wilderness, and they try to leave them in peace the best they can. All those stories about that place were meant to scare people away, but it wasn't for the reasons I had previously thought. Like many of the others who used to guide out there, I stopped running guided hunts well before the area was closed. Every once in a while, hikers still go out into the valley, but they are few and far between. And the people who live out there seem to avoid them at all costs. I was a college student studying abroad in a small village in the gorgeous mountains of Ireland. It was a beautiful, quaint little town with an old castle and a small market square where locals would gather to buy and sell their goods. The villagers were friendly, and I quickly made friends with a group of students who were also studying abroad. But things started to take a strange turn when we began to hear strange noises coming from the castle at night. It started with just a few whispers here and there, but soon the whispers turned into wails and screams. It freaked us out, and as foolish as it now sounds, we decided we had to check things out. I was a curious student with a love for adventure. Still do love to be adventurous, but I've wizened up a little in my old age. I was always fascinated by the paranormal and the unexplained, and I saw this as an opportunity to investigate something that could potentially be supernatural. My friends were just as curious as I was, and we all agreed that we had to find out what was really happening in the castle. Our first sighting of something truly strange was when we all saw a shadowy figure passing by the windows. We were all terrified, but at the same time, it was absolutely thrilling. We were all into ghost shows and paranormal investigations and all that stuff. This was an opportunity to do the investigating ourselves. We were so excited. We decided to investigate the next day, but we found nothing out of the ordinary. Over the next few nights, we continued to hear strange noises coming from the castle, but we didn't see anything and couldn't capture any evidence. It wasn't until one night when we were exploring the castle grounds that we found an old hidden passage that led deep into the castle. We knew we had to explore it. As we made our way through the passage, we saw strange symbols and markings on the walls, and all of us felt uneasy and nauseous. There was something truly unnerving about the passage. Then we all heard strange whispers and voices that seemed to be coming from nowhere. It was horrifying, and a couple of my friends ran back screaming, but the rest of us pushed on. Then we heard this loud, piercing scream that made us all scream in terror. We all booked it out of there, screaming and crying. There was a door at the end of that passage that we almost made it to, but it was clear something didn't want us in there. We met a local historian at a pub who told us that the castle had a dark history of witchcraft and the occult. He warned us to stay away, but we had already made it this far. What could possibly be in that door? The next night, we made our way back down the passage, pretty much trembling and tiptoeing the whole way down. We opened up the door, and it led us to a round room with an altar in the middle with melted candles all over the place. There were old knives, swords, and creepy symbols all over the walls, and a big pentagram was painted red on the floor. One of my friends had the idea to light the candles and try to communicate with whatever forces were haunting the castle. In hindsight, we were asking for it. Big time. But at the time, it was just part of an exciting adventure into the unknown, and we were all changed people when we returned from it. We lit the candles and started asking stupid questions like, "Is anybody here? What do you want from us? Why haven't you moved on?" None of us really knew what we were doing, but there was so much activity in that castle, we knew something was bound to happen. Just when we were about to call it quits, all of the candles went out at once and the door slammed shut. We all screamed in terror. We piled over to the door, but we realized it was locked shut. We all absolutely panicked. We eventually lit the candles back up and tried to come up with some sort of game plan to open the door. Suddenly, we noticed this thick, black, shadowy smoke that was swirling around the room. The smoke got denser and denser and eventually formed into a figure above the altar. The figure let out this deep, horrible growl that I could only describe as demonic. It seemed to be coming from multiple sources, and it got louder and louder. Finally, one of my friends kicked the door down, and we all clambered out of there and never went back. None of us slept that night, and we sat around profusely researching everything we could find about that castle. We eventually found out that the castle had a long history of occult witchcraft, and there was supposedly a shadow demon that had been summoned by witches to do their bidding. I cannot stress enough how lucky I am to be alive after that encounter with the shadow demon in the castle. It was an experience that changed my life forever. Looking back, we were so foolish to even attempt to investigate the paranormal without any proper knowledge or experience. We were lucky that we didn't get hurt or our souls possessed by the forces we were dealing with. It was a miracle that we made it out alive and intact. That experience taught me the importance of respecting the forces that we cannot see or comprehend. I still have a fascination with the occult, witchcraft, and the supernatural in general, but now I approach it with respect, knowledge, preparation, and caution. I've realized that there is so much out there that we cannot fully understand or control. That's why it's so important to spend our energy on what we can control. The experience also taught me that there are dark forces out there that are constantly trying to affect us in negative ways. It's up to us to use our God-given powers for good and to defeat those forces. We have the power to create positive change and to protect ourselves and those around us from the negative forces that exist in the world. It's a responsibility that we all have, and it's important to take it seriously. Something strange happened to me about 5 years ago. I was at my friend's house having a bonfire, and we were all sitting around it relaxing and talking when something caught our attention. The sky to the west looked like it had been completely lit on fire, but there wasn't any lightning or thunder, just a red glow. We had a really good view of it because this took place in Montana, where the sky is huge, and you can see really, really far in every direction. So it seemed like whatever this was would start high in the sky and then move down towards the horizon very quickly. We watched for about 15 minutes as it kept moving up and down repeatedly until it disappeared behind some trees. Now we were at his house all the time, and even after that first night, we would see lights flashing around his property every now and then, but nothing like what we saw that first time. And then, a few months later, he got called into work early one morning. We had all spent the night and were all awake, so me and another friend decided to go out riding ATVs before sunrise, which is common here. We went out to a trail that goes through some state land where you can ride pretty much wherever you want. We were about halfway through when we came to a clearing and saw something in the distance that looked like it was on fire, but there wasn't any smoke or smell coming from it, just that same red glow as before. It was just hovering above the ground. Then, as we were watching, all of a sudden it darted straight up into the sky and disappeared behind some low-lying clouds. I have never seen a UFO before, but I knew right away that's what it was. I was sure of it. We had no idea what to do, so we turned around and just went back to his house and didn't talk about it. The next day, my friend who owned the property asked if we saw anything weird out there, and when I told him about it, he said he had seen something like that a few times out in the woods behind his house too, but never wanted to mention it to us because it seemed so crazy. He also said that one time he was driving down a gravel road on his property at night and saw lights flashing around him, but didn't see anything causing them. After all of that, we would see strange things from time to time, but nothing else as crazy as those two incidents. Oh yeah, and one last thing. This guy has been having strange electrical issues with his house for a while now. Lights would go on and off by themselves. Appliances would turn on when they weren't plugged in, etc. He thought it was just faulty wiring or something like that until he started having issues with his phone too. His phone would ring, but there wouldn't be anyone calling him. Then the call would hang up without him answering it. I'm not sure if this is related to what we saw, but those incidents happened around the same time as everything else we had seen and heard. I can pinpoint the exact day when everything changed, and it all started with what I believe to be a dogman encounter. I was driving home from work on a Friday night, and I was driving my wife's small Toyota Corolla. Anyway, at this time of day, there wasn't a lot of traffic along the roads, but as I rounded a curve, I could see this enormous dog standing off in the distance, right in the middle of the road. But it didn't look like any average dog. It had the markings of a dog in shape, but it looked to be at least 7.5 feet tall, had dark brown fur with white markings on his chest and legs, and it was standing straight up like a person would on two legs. Actually, from this distance, it kind of reminded me of my old neighbor's dog, a Great Pyrenees, but that might just be because it was so big. This dog also had a very wide positioning with his front paws, that actually looked like hands, out in front of him like he was guarding something. Even from about 40 feet away, I could see the muscles rippling under its fur as it stood there looking directly at me in the car, still holding its hands out as if to keep me away. The vast majority of dogs run away from cars as they approach, so I assumed it would do the same thing as I slowly drove closer. But I approached to within 25 feet or so. This dog still stood there motionless as if he was waiting for me to do something. I rolled down my window and yelled, but he still didn't move. I wanted to drive around him, but when I moved to the side to pass it, it took a giant step over to continue blocking me. Realizing this dog thing was intent on keeping me there, I started to get a little worried. I turned the wheel to try and go around him again, but as I began moving, it dropped down on all fours and started running toward me at full speed. I had never seen an animal move that fast before. It was very gracefully galloping along like a horse, but its gait looked off somehow, as if both front legs were bending backward at the same time. My brain was finally starting to realize that this was not a normal dog like I had been rationalizing it was. I gunned the engine to pull away from it as quickly as possible, but by now it was too close for me to avoid hitting it even if I wanted to. When my front bumper came within about 2 feet of its chest, this giant dogman actually jumped up over the hood of my car to land on the roof with a loud thud and laid down up there, peering in at me through the rear windshield. As I looked in my rearview mirror, I could see it looking back at me through the windshield with a look on its face as if to say, "Are you afraid now?" I immediately sped up, hoping to knock it off my roof and get out of there. But when I did, this thing jumped off the roof and onto the trunk and slammed into it, but stayed there, propping itself on by holding onto the rear spoiler, still looking in at me. I knew that he had more than likely dented up my car, so I started slowing down, and eventually came to a stop. Luckily, by this time, I could see another car coming up behind me, and I needed their help and didn't want them to pass me by. So I got out and stood in the road with my hands out, waving them around frantically and pointing to the dog thing on my car. The other car pulled over and 3 college-age kids got out, 2 guys and 1 girl. They ran over toward me just as the creature stepped off the trunk and started walking toward them, but still looking at me as if to keep me from leaving. The kids stopped running and stood in place as they all realized this dog thing was walking toward them. It sniffed the air a few times as it got close and circled around them a few times. Then it turned back and started running full speed toward me again. I watched as it got closer and closer to me, and when it got to about 15 feet or so, it quickly dodged out of the way and off to the side of the road. We had a standoff with this creature with the 4 of us barely moving an inch and just watching it with our eyes. We also glanced back and forth at each other without moving our bodies. The looks we gave each other said more than words ever could. Soon into this standoff, this dog-looking creature turned its head up towards the sky and let out a scream that sounded half human, half wolf. It pierced through the air in a way that felt like the noise could knock over trees. I know that's a really strange thought, but the sound was sharp, if that makes any sense. I looked at these kids and asked what that thing was, but they just stared back at me without saying anything. Finally, one of them was able to speak and said they didn't know what the heck it was. I said I wasn't 100% sure either, but thought it was a dog man that we all just experienced. That's when I told them that we should get in our cars and leave before this thing does something else to us. It was now looking around, and I was worried that it had called out to more of its kind with that call. We all slowly got into our respective cars without looking at each other or acknowledging each other in any way. We were kind of on autopilot. It felt like there was an unspoken agreement between us about not wanting to say anything out loud so as not to snap the dogman back into charging at us. We all knew and understood that we had to get out of there as soon as possible. I mean, they had seen this thing too, and we were all on the same page on this. I got into my car and started driving very slowly past where that thing was standing, hoping it would stay put. It didn't, though. It started running after my car to keep up with me. It got to within 10 feet of catching up with us several times, but no matter how fast I drove, it still stayed close behind. I remember looking at the speedometer and seeing that I was going 60 and the speed limit was only 45. It didn't seem like I was going that fast, but the fact that it stayed right up on me like that tells me that these things can run faster than I thought. I don't think it really wanted to catch me, though. I think it was just playing with me in this point because I had seen what it could really do. As if it knew what I was thinking, the dog creature quickly looked at me in my car through the back window and gave me a smirk, with all of its teeth showing, then it barked loudly. It then turned around and ran into the woods on my right. And just as it did, I watched as hundreds of birds came flying out of the woods. A huge flock covered the sky as they went up and left the area. It was a really strange sight to see, especially at that time of day, which made it obvious to me that they were feeling threatened. It made me wonder if that creature was settling into one of their trees for the night. But I really have no idea if dogmen sleep in trees. I slowed down but continued to drive as I watched all of this transpire, and then once I was safely past, I looked in my back window and saw nothing but darkness. That's when I sped up to get the hell out of there. When I got on the main road to go home, I could tell that the others had done the same thing. At least that's what I hoped they had done, because I didn't see their car anywhere. I never did get to actually talk with those college kids that stopped, and I often think about them.